Whenever a Disney retrospective reaches The Jungle Book, it's always a little sad. This was the final animated movie Walt Disney was personally involved with to a notable extent before he died in December 1966. And as we'll see, he had a lot to say about how The Jungle Book turned out. But first, a quick note on the main character's name. I will sometimes accidentally pronounce someone's name wrong. I could have sworn Magica De Spell's name was pronounced Magica, for example. But this time, it's on Disney. The main character's name is Mowgli in the books, and pronounced Mowgli in Disney properties. So when I'm talking about the Kipling original, I'll use the correct pronunciation, and say Mowgli when talking about Disney's version. The Jungle Book and the Second Jungle Book were collections of short stories by Rudyard Kipling, published in 1894 and 1895. The majority of these stories followed the adventures of Mowgli, a boy who was raised by wolves in the Indian jungle. Since almost every Mowgli story was used or considered in some way, shape, or form for Disney's franchise, I'll try to summarize them all as concisely as I can. As a baby, Mowgli is left with his parents in the jungle when they are attacked by a tiger, Shere Khan. In the confusion, his parents flee, leaving the infant behind. Before Khan can claim the baby, the infant wanders into a wolf den. The wolf family takes an immediate liking to him and refuse to give him up to the tiger. At one of the regular wolf pack meetings, Mowgli is voted into the pack with help from Bagheera the panther and Baloo the bear. Shere Khan, furious that he was denied the baby as a meal, harbors a grudge against Mowgli as the boy grows older and learns the ways of the jungle. During his youth, Mowgli makes friends with the Bandar-Log, the jungle's monkeys, despite being warned not to. The monkeys decide that they want Mowgli to teach them the ways of man to help them be the most respected creatures in the jungle. They kidnap Mowgli, but due to their forgetful, careless nature, they soon forget why they did so in the first place. Bagheera and Baloo seek the help of Kaa the snake to save Mowgli from the Cold Lairs, the abandoned human city the monkeys live in. Shere Khan, meanwhile, has been turning the younger wolves against Mowgli and the wolf leader Akela. Without Akela's protection, the tiger believes he can finally make a meal of Mowgli. Mowgli steals fire from the man village and uses it to frighten Khan and the enemy wolves. Realizing he has become more man than animal, he heads down into the man village to live as one of them. Khan continues to stalk around the village, hellbent on revenge. With the help of some of his wolf brethren, Mowgli starts a buffalo stampede and kills Shere Khan once and for all. Unfortunately, during his stay in the village, Mowgli makes another enemy. Buldeo, the village's arrogant chief hunter, butts heads with the man cub a few times. Mowgli is the only one to call him out on his exaggerated stories. When Buldeo finds Mowgli skinning what's left of Shere Khan after the stampede, he tries to take credit for the kill himself. Mowgli sicks Akela the wolf on him in retaliation. The intention was merely to scare Buldeo, and it only works too well. The hunter accuses Mowgli of being a sorcerer, and he finds himself expelled from the village. It doesn't stop there, unfortunately. Mowgli finds out that his adopted parents in the village are going to be executed, accused of witchcraft themselves. Furious, Mowgli gets his parents to safety, and then systematically has his animal brethren destroy the village over a series of a few weeks. Now back in the jungle, Mowgli's adventures continue. In one story, Kaa shows him a massive treasure hidden under the monkey's cold lairs, guarded by an old cobra. Mowgli doesn't understand the concept of money, but takes a knife from the treasure. This ends up attracting several groups of treasure-seeking humans who kill each other for the knife. Disturbed by the events, Mowgli returns the knife to the cold lairs. In another story, Mowgli battles a pack of dholes, wild dogs. Finally, he becomes restless and heads back to live among his own kind. Not because he was driven out by tigers or wolves, but by his own volition. The Jungle Book was pitched to Disney by Bill Peet, who had written and storyboarded their previous two animated films, 101 Dalmatians and The Sword and Stone. Peet's Jungle Book was very close in tone to the Kipling original. Villain-wise, Shere Khan and Buldeo would be the main heavies that Mowgli would face, with the Bandar-Log and their unruly king adding some extra difficulties. In this version, like the book, the monkeys have a vast hidden treasure in their ancient city, which Mowgli sees no value in. The first part of Peet's draft seems similar to the final version, while the second half takes a left turn. Mowgli gets to the man village, and like in the book, makes an enemy of Buldeo. Once again, Mowgli calls out Buldeo's tall tales. The boy grows fed up with the village and returns to the jungle, followed by the hunter. Buldeo forces Mowgli to take him to the monkey's hidden treasure. He then plans to burn down the jungle, killing Mowgli and Shere Khan. Before he can do this, the tiger leaps out and kills him. Mowgli grabs Buldeo's rifle and shoots Khan, making him a hero in the jungle and the village. Walt was initially on board with this, but after looking over everything they'd come up with, he realized something. This wasn't the movie he had wanted to make. It was too dark, too somber. It was very close in tone to Kipling's book, but that was the problem. The decision was made to make the movie a fun, lighter experience. Bill Peet left shortly after that, unhappy with the turn of events. The rewrite cut Buldeo, but kept the monkeys and Shere Khan. Kaa, who had only made a cameo in Peet's version, became a full-fledged character. With all that in mind, let's look at our rundown of villains in the Jungle Book. This movie ended up with 3 villains, all of them unrelated: Shere Khan, Kaa, and King Louie. When I encountered a similar situation with the Pinocchio villains, I ordered them by appearance. This was because they all sort of led into each other, with Foulfellow and Gideon selling Pinocchio first to Stromboli, and then to the coachman. In this video, though, I'm going to start with Shere Khan. He's the final villain to directly appear, but he's a looming threat throughout the movie, and he's responsible for Mowgli's whole journey in the first place. In Kipling's book, Shere Khan was born with a bad leg. His mother even called him Lungri, meaning lame one. You can understand how that might give someone a complex. In spite of this, or perhaps because of this, Khan carries himself with an exaggerated sense of pride. His leg makes it difficult to catch prey, so Khan often kills humans. An unarmed human, after all, is basically defenseless. The rest of the animals look down on Khan for this. It's against the law of the jungle to kill a human. The animals say it's because it's so unsportsmanlike, but the narration tells us it's also because vengeful men will attack the jungle in retaliation. Because of his man-killing, Khan is largely viewed with disdain by the jungle denizens. The closest thing he has to a friend is Tabaki, a brown-nosing little jackal that follows him around. And Tabaki is seen as even more of an outcast. Not to mention he has rabies. With this in mind, it's easy to feel some pity for Khan. This was Darwinism at work here. But Khan is still a cruel, arrogant character. The only reason he repeatedly targets Mowgli throughout the book is because he didn't get to eat him as a baby. It's a matter of pride to Khan, and that's ultimately what does him in. The Disney version was generally more fearsome. Not to say that Kipling's Shere Khan wasn't a threat. A lame tiger is still a tiger. But because of his lawless, arrogant behavior, Khan was seen as more of a nuisance by the wolves than a real threat. It's only when he begins undermining Akila's leadership that he becomes a problem. Disney took away his bad leg and made Khan the most feared predator in the jungle. No one, not even the entire wolf pack, is willing to stand against him. And while Shere Khan still has a major arrogance streak, it feels well-earned, rather than compensating. Even when Bill Peet was still on board, Walt made it clear that he wanted a strong, confident tiger for the villain. Peet's Shere Khan still had intense hatred of Mowgli, but had just as much of an enemy in Buldeo. The two even sang a song together called The Mighty Hunters. I've also heard it referred to as the Hate Song. In the song, both villains stalk each other through the jungle, while boasting about their eventual triumph over the other. After Peet left, there were many efforts made to make the story a more fun, farcical romp. Several characters became more comedic, like Hathi the elephant going from a noble leader to a buffoonish drill sergeant. Story notes from 1965 indicate there were attempts to make Khan more humorous as well. The vain tiger takes pride in his appearance, and has kept his coat nice by becoming vegetarian. He knows exactly how many calories are in a man, depending on his size. That's all the notes say, but presumably he would have made an exception in his diet for the little man cub. I have no idea if this concept ever got any traction beyond this description. The final version of Khan is still funny, but in a very dry way. Out of all the alterations to the characters, Shere Khan is the only one who became more threatening. Shere Khan doesn't actually appear until the movie's final act. This is unusual for a main villain, but they do a wonderful job of building him up. For most of the film, Khan is a looming presence, taken seriously by all the animals. All we know is that he is somewhere nearby, potentially lurking behind any tree or inside any shrub. Thus, when he does finally make a physical appearance, it doesn't feel like he popped out of nowhere like the Queen of Hearts did in Alice. No more playing with monkeys. Things are actually getting serious. All the animals in the jungle understandably dislike man, but Khan seems to hate them the most. Because of their guns and fire, they're the only thing more dangerous than Khan. In addition to fearing for his hide, I imagine Khan hates being reminded that he's actually not the apex predator. It doesn't matter that Mowgli's a child and doesn't want anything to do with the man village. Khan doesn't want to take any risks. And based on how the original book ends, where Mowgli decides to go to the village on his own volition, perhaps Khan's fears were not totally unjustified. Although Shere Khan's fear of fire seems to be an open secret among the animals, he remains arrogant and incredibly confident. All animals run from Shere Khan, who prefers it that way.
Now, I'm going to close my eyes and count to 10. It makes the chase more interesting. For me.
His voice actor, George Sanders, gives a wonderful performance, delivering his lines in a very droll way. Often known for playing cynical cads, he chats about hunting and killing Mowgli as if he's at a cocktail party. Khan is above everyone else, and he never wants the animals to forget that. Behind the scenes, Sanders was offered a drawing of Shere Khan. He casually accepted it. When asked if he would like Walt Disney to sign it, Sanders replied, "How utterly absurd. Why would I want his signature? He might want mine. I created the character." It's a funny story, but it should be noted that Sanders was actually friends with Walt. Walt, in fact, had suggested Sanders for the role in the first place. As much as I can praise Sanders' performance, I should also note his singing voice. Shere Khan's impressive baritone line in That's What Friends Are For was provided by studio singer Bill Lee. Disney fans will recognize him as Roger's singing voice in 101 Dalmatians. Musical theater fans may know him as Captain Von Trapp's singing voice in The Sound of Music, or Joseph Cable's singing voice in South Pacific. He was a great singer, but, ironically, an unsung talent. No matter his confidence, Shere Khan ultimately goes into a blind panic when actually confronted with fire. Rather than be killed by a stampede like in the book, or a rifle like in Bill Pete's draft, it is fire that undoes the tiger. Instead of killing him, Khan ends up running off in fear, utterly humiliated. His entire persona has been shattered. I imagine part of this was to keep The Jungle Book a firmly upbeat movie. Complete speculation here, but since Walt Disney's death hit everyone so hard, I feel like they wanted to send him off on a high note. There was also talk of a sequel, so perhaps keeping the tiger alive was seen as a smart move. And yes, we did get a sequel in 2003, but they had been toying with the idea of doing one directly after the first. A bit more on that later. Shere Khan is a terrific villain, in spite of his short screen time. But he's not the only one. The jungle is full of dangers, including Kaa the Python. The book version of Kaa was not a villain at all, although he was still quite dangerous. When Mowgli is taken by the monkeys, Baloo and Bagheera have no choice but to approach Kaa, the only thing the monkeys fear. They do so with great hesitancy. Kaa is very old, very respected, and very powerful. The snake does agree to help recover Mowgli, and almost single-handedly wins the battle against the monkeys. Okay, he doesn't have hands at all, but you know what I mean. Once he has fended off the little creatures, Kaa demonstrates his hypnotic powers. Doing what he calls the Dance of the Hunger of Kaa, Kaa moves his body in a way that entrances the monkeys into walking right into his open mouth. Baloo and Bagheera find themselves drawn to him as well, and have to be snapped out of it by Mowgli. After this, Kaa becomes Mowgli's friend and ally. Due to his age, he has an intricate knowledge of the jungle's history. This comes in handy when finding a way to drive off the invading dholes in the Red Dog story. When the older Mowgli finally leaves the jungle, Kaa joins Baloo and Bagheera in bidding him an emotional farewell. It appears that Bill Pete's draft of the story regulated Kaa to a cameo. After Mowgli leaves the wolf pack with Bagheera, they stop at a tree to rest. Kaa comes down, quickly hypnotizes Mowgli, and is about to eat him when he's stopped by the panther. Sheepishly, Kaa apologizes. He didn't realize the man-cub was Bagheera's friend. Mowgli indignantly throws down Kaa's tail, which causes the snake to comically plunge into the bushes. This scene was expanded upon in the final movie, giving Kaa a larger, more sinister role. Now he's furious at Bagheera for interrupting his meal. Even the panther finds himself trembling when face to face with the hungry Kaa. In a moment, he's put under a trance. Kaa's hypnotic powers have gone from a mesmerizing dance to a pair of psychedelic spiraling eyes. When his victims fall under his spell, their eyes begin to spiral too. We are very much in the 60s here. Although Kaa is certainly dangerous, he can also be quite clownish. Animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston cited Kaa's flaw as being overconfident in himself. Bagheera is at first unaware that Mowgli is in the snake's coils, and it's Kaa who actually gives himself away.
Now, no more talk till the morning.
He won't be here in the morning.
No, yes, he will.
If Kaa had kept his mouth shut... Wait, his mouth needs to be open. Let me start over. If Kaa had just kept quiet, he could have eaten the man-cub easily. And later on, when he has Mowgli exactly where he wants him, with no friends in sight, he takes the time to play with his food, only for Shere Khan to interrupt him. Shere Khan is unaffected by Kaa's hypnosis, and seems to be the only animal the snake fears. Once again, Khan is the most powerful animal, and although he chats politely with Kaa, their power dynamic is clear. Kaa is not only lower on the food chain than Khan, but for this video's sake, he's less of a villain as well. The snake only tries to eat Mowgli because he runs into him twice, and both times, he ends up sulking off in shame. Compare this to Shere Khan, who relentlessly stalks the man-cub with the intention to kill first. Actually eating Mowgli seems like a secondary priority. The tiger wants the boy dead, plain and simple. Kaa just wants a meal. This brings us to a point I've been wanting to make for a while regarding predators. In the past, I've said that I generally don't count predators as villains, but here we have a character who is very much a predator. The difference between Kaa and, say, the pike from The Sword and the Stone is that Kaa isn't just doing this for survival. He's taking pleasure in it. Compare the wolf from Peter and the Wolf to the big bad wolf. The titular wolf is ferocious, but he mostly acts like a real feral beast. Big Bad, meanwhile, is a cunning trickster who develops a personal grudge against his prey. And although Kaa is not quite as evil as him, it's his sinister playfulness with his victims that elevates him to villain status. In fact, generally speaking, the villain characters are the ones we actually see stalking and potentially killing their prey. Bagheera and the wolves are good guys, and most definitely predators, but we never see them hunting. Kaa's voice was an interesting choice. Disney regular Sterling Holloway is most recognizable as Winnie the Pooh. His distinct, soft, sweet voice was perfect for friendly characters, with his only other somewhat villainous role being the Cheshire Cat. As Kaa, he does a generally similar performance to his other roles, but the very fact that his voice is coming out of a carnivorous snake makes it incredibly creepy. He's an easy character to let your guard down around, and that has undoubtedly been the mistake of many poor animals. Kaa's haunting song, Trust in Me, was salvaged from Mary Poppins. The Sherman brothers had planned out an elaborate sequence where the characters would travel to different worlds using a magic compass. They would have visited a desert at one point and seen different mirages appear and disappear. A song called The Land of Sand would have accompanied this scene. When the compass idea was cut, they used the melody and wrote new lyrics for Kaa. They were sure to add many S sounds so they could put emphasis on Kaa being a snake. Finally, we have King Louie and his monkeys. Old King Louie has proven to be so fun and lovable, it's easy to forget he's a villain in the first place. It certainly feels like Disney does sometimes. In the Kipling book, the monkeys are collectively known as the Bandar-Log. They think of themselves as great, noble creatures, but their scatterbrained nature prevents them from accomplishing any of the great deeds they claim to do. Completely disorganized, they do not obey the law of the jungle and are looked down upon by all the other creatures. It doesn't help that they're also rude, loud, and generally annoying. On a whim, because they do everything on a whim, the monkeys decide that Mowgli is the key to making them respectable. They take him to an abandoned city, the Cold Lairs, so he can share his knowledge. They admire his skill for weaving sticks together for shelter, and want him to teach them. Unfortunately, their attention span does not allow any room for learning. Mowgli quickly gets fed up with them, but they won't allow him to leave. When Baloo and Bagheera come to rescue their friend, the monkeys put up an impressive fight, massively outnumbering the bear and panther. As I said, it is Kaa who saves the day, and feasts on many Bandar-Log. Bill Pete's draft for the movie generally stuck close to the tone of the book, but he did make a deviation. He gave the Bandar-Log an actual leader. Although their king isn't much smarter than the rest of the monkeys, the idea that they had any vague form of government went against the anarchy-loving monkeys from the book. That's not a slight against Pete, just an observation. Aside from having a king, the monkeys seemed pretty in line with their book counterparts. Their boastful song, Monkey See, Monkey Do, solidified their unwarranted egos. King Louie, a large orangutan, was originally portrayed as a harsh, unreasonable character. When the story was taken in a lighter direction, the storymen struggled to come up with a way to make Mowgli's kidnapping a less traumatic experience. The Sherman brothers had the idea to make Louie and his monkeys a group of party animals. They swing from trees, they're swingers, and Louie is the biggest party animal of all, king of the swingers. By all means, Louie comes off as a friendly guy and a gracious host. He will offer you more bananas than you can possibly stomach. He'll entertain you, he'll sing and dance. It's easy to forget in a moment that he kidnapped a child for nefarious purposes. Being a king isn't good enough. Louie wants power. He wants to learn how to use fire, or as most of the jungle calls it, the red flower. Mowgli, despite being a human, has no idea how to make fire since he was raised by wolves. It makes perfect sense, but Louie will not take no for an answer. What does Louie plan to do with the fire? It's never specified, but I imagine he wants to lord it over the other animals, to prove that he's the top banana. It's unclear if Louie knows just how dangerous fire actually is, but he probably wouldn't care either way. King Louie might not be evil, but he's a selfish, careless character at his core. He doesn't care that kidnapping Mowgli might be scary for the man-cub. He doesn't give a thought to the safety of the jungle or even his own monkeys where fire is concerned. And one gets a nagging feeling that if Baloo and Bagheera hadn't have shown up when they did, Mowgli would find himself in a lot of trouble. But we really don't think about any of this during the monkey sequence. All we see is fun, silly King Louie throwing a hell of a party. We definitely need to applaud the Sherman brothers for making a potentially unpleasant scene a lot of fun with their idea. A good deal of credit also goes to Louie's voice actor. Originally, they had Louis Armstrong in mind for the role. Walt wisely realized that casting a black man as an ape who wants to be seen as a legitimate human could come across as offensive. Instead, the Sherman brothers approached nightclub performer Louis Prima. They played the insanely catchy song I Wanna Be Like You for Prima, who was instantly taken with the idea. Prima put a lot of himself in the role, and even had his band record their own swinging version of the song. Their performance was deemed a bit too wild, and the version we have in the movie was apparently dialed down a bit. One of Prima's gimmicks was leading the band on a parade through the audience, which is what the monkeys do near the end of the song. As for the rest of the Bandar-Log, they mostly exist to party with Louie and do his bidding. The only one with a semblance of notoriety is Flunky Monkey, Louie's white-haired attendant. Flunky, voiced by Leo DeLeon, comes close to upstaging as king at a few points, something Louie will definitely not stand for. The rest of the Bandar-Log are collectively voiced by Bill Skiles and Pete Henderson, a pair of comedians who, fittingly enough, got their start at Disneyland. Louis Prima loved playing King Louie, and returned for a record album produced the next year. More Jungle Book was made with the intention of seeing whether or not audiences wanted, well, more Jungle Book. Presumably, if it sold well enough, a sequel would have been greenlit. Sales were not as high as they had hoped, and the idea of a sequel was shelved for a while. In the story, Baloo has gone into a deep depression after losing Mowgli. King Louie, who seems to have made peace with the other animals, tries to help. He sneaks into the village to find the man-cub. There, he actually gets the chance to touch the forbidden red flower, and he does not like how surprisingly painful it is. For the time being, he is no longer interested in fire. Prima reprised his role one last time in another record. Let's hear it for Robin Hood. Released in 1974, the whole album is narrated by King Louie. He assures us that he was actually best friends with the famous outlaw. It's quite a listen. The Jungle Book is one of those properties that has spawned many follow-ups and spin-offs. For the sake of this video, the next piece of media we're looking at is the original movie's direct sequel from 2003. Picking up a few months after he goes to the Man Village, we open on Mowgli giving a shadow puppet recap of the first movie. This is the first time the original movie is summarized. The second time is the rest of the sequel, which hits almost every beat of the 1967 classic. That means our old friends, Shere Khan and Kaa, are waiting for us once more. As for King Louie, well, we'll get to that shortly. The news of Shere Khan's fiery humiliation has spread throughout the jungle. Although the tiger is perfectly fine physically, his pride has been wounded, and the only solution in his eyes is to sneak into the Man Village and kill Mowgli. He was still dead set on this in the first movie, but he had a sense of humor about the whole thing. Now the fun is over. No games of hide-and-seek, no chatting beforehand. He wants blood. The sinister Tony Jay replaces George Sanders, having already voiced Khan a few times before this. And what a replacement he is. Both men did wonders with this role. It's hard to dislike any performance by Tony Jay. At several points along the way, a vulture named Lucky incessantly mocks the tiger. We're supposed to hate Khan, but Lucky proves to be so irritating that it's not hard to smile when the tiger mauls him. Unfortunately for Khan, and perhaps us, Lucky lives up to his name. At the end, Khan finds himself trapped in a ruined temple, inexplicably surrounded by lava. And who should show up to mock him but Lucky, having survived his beating? Kaa once again happens upon Mowgli, and later Shanti, the girl from the first movie. The snake is now voiced by Jim Cummings, who had also voiced him several times prior. Kaa is opportunistic as ever, and tries to make a meal of the humans again. While he did suffer a few indignant defeats in the first movie, this time he mostly exists to get clobbered. I really can't overstate how much of a beating he takes. While most of the movie is very much a mediocre Disney sequel, I appreciate the sheer amount of slapstick they subject this poor snake to. I can tell this was fun to storyboard. King Louie only makes a tiny appearance during Mowgli's shadow puppet show. Baloo later makes a vague allusion to Louie leaving his temple, and nothing more is ever said about his absence. The reason is actually because of a lawsuit. Louie Prima's widow had argued that her husband had put a lot of himself into King Louie. His voice was a huge part of the character. She felt that her family was owed royalties from future appearances of the character, even when it wasn't Prima himself doing the voice. This had come about from TaleSpin, where King Louie was voiced by Jim Cummings, who did a pretty solid impression of Prima's voice. For this reason, King Louie did not appear in Jungle Book 2. The House of Mouse series ran into a similar problem around this time. They really wanted to do an episode about Louie, but had to change the character to King Larry, Louie's identical twin brother. Jim Cummings voiced the character again, but had to tweak his performance a bit to avoid sounding too much like Prima. In recent years, they seem to have eased up a bit on the Louie ban. As we'll talk about in the 2016 remake, Christopher Walken's performance is very divorced from Prima. Louie has also recently made vocal appearances at the Disney parks, so we'll see what the future holds for the King of the Swingers. In the sequel, meanwhile, Flunky, now called MC Monkey, seems to have taken over leadership duties. Jim Cummings does provide the voice, but it's different from Louie Prima. Baloo has become friends with the monkeys, which makes sense. He and Louie had some great chemistry in the first movie in the one moment when they were partying. If the circumstances were different, they really could have been the best of friends. The sequel definitely feels like it's lacking something without Louie. I don't know if the character would have made the movie better, but it really doesn't feel like the Disney Jungle Book if Louie's not around. A third Jungle Book movie was actually planned at one point. Baloo and Shere Khan would have been captured by the Russian circus, and Mowgli would rescue them. Apparently, Shere Khan would have finally gotten over his urge to kill the man cub by the end of the movie. Fascinating, but that's unfortunately all the information we have about this unproduced sequel. The Jungle Book has had 2 live-action remakes, one in 1994 and one in 2016. We'll be talking about them both, but I'm actually going to start with the 2016 version. I feel the video will flow better this way because this movie is a direct remake. The 94 version was more of its own thing, but more on that soon. The 2016 movie gives Shere Khan, voiced by Idris Elba, a much larger role. While Khan was always the driving force of the story, here he's given more screen time and more to do in general. His hatred of Mowgli is given a bit more depth as well. He's responsible for killing Mowgli's father, who in turn blinds him in one eye with a torch. Although baby Mowgli had nothing to do with this, it's enough reason for Khan to target him later on. This is all coupled, of course, with Shere Khan's usual hatred of mankind. The tiger remains a terror of the jungle, stated to kill for fun rather than just survival. Contrast him with Bagheera, the other large jungle cat. During a drought, the animals declare a truce at the waterhole, a scene adapted from the Kipling book. Bagheera politely assures the frightened prey that he remembers their truce. Shere Khan struts around menacingly, still obeying the truce, but being as intimidating as possible. He's a bully, but he's no paper tiger. This version of Khan is just as threatening as the original animated one. Not only does Shere Khan have a bigger presence in the movie, but the wolf pack does as well. For such major characters in the book, the 60s movie barely gave them any thought, and they were not seen or mentioned in the sequel. The remake works in the plot point from the book of Shere Khan trying to turn the pack against Mowgli. Although he doesn't succeed as well as he did in Kipling's story, he does manage to kill Akela quite suddenly. As always, he's feared for a good reason. Kaa's role, on the other hand, is lessened. Now a female snake, voiced by Scarlett Johansson, what Kaa lacks in screen time, she makes up for in intimidation. She is absolutely huge, much closer to Kipling's idea. The thing that links her to the animated version is the hypnotic eyes. Like in the book, she has a vast knowledge of the jungle's history, and shows Mowgli his own backstory as she prepares to eat him. Although this version of Kaa is certainly not Mowgli's friend, some concept art implies that she was to become his ally later on. We can see Baloo and Bagheera approaching her, presumably for help in fighting Louie and the monkeys. This idea was never used, and Kaa is last seen getting fought off by Baloo. ScarJo does get to perform a silky version of Trust in Me over the credits, sounding almost like a James Bond song. Out of all the villains, the remake has the most fun with King Louie. Ironically, this is done by making him less fun, at least in the traditional sense. All of Louie's friendly, zany aspects have been done away with. Without his fun-loving side, it's impossible to ignore the fact that Louie is crazy, power-hungry, and very dangerous. Also, he's massive. Also, he's voiced by Christopher Walken. Louie has been reimagined as a Gigantopithecus, a giant extinct species of ape. This is partially because orangutans are not native to India, and partially to make him an intimidating monster for Mowgli to face. I have a feeling this Louie, who comes off like a mafia don, is closer to how Bill Peet originally envisioned the character. I love the original King Louie, but I also really like this version. One of the best and weirdest moments has Louie randomly burst into his I Wanna Be Like You song. Aside from Baloo and Mowgli playfully singing a bit of the bare necessities together, this movie has not been a musical. But the randomness works in this case. No one else is singing with Louie. Not only is Mowgli standing in front of a monster who's demanding something the child cannot give him, now the monster is singing to music only he can hear. This kid knew he was in trouble, but now he realizes the trouble is even worse than he thought. The 1994 remake, while also a pretty enjoyable film, is much farther apart from the cartoon. It is technically the first live-action remake Disney ever did, but it actually didn't start as a Disney movie. It was meant to be an independent film, and was bought by Disney along the way. There are a few references to the Disney movie, notably the presence of King Louie, but it's generally an original story based more on the books than the animated film. As far as this film's retrospective is concerned, the first relevant section is when some monkeys steal a bracelet from Mowgli. This bracelet is his one connection to the human world, and while Mowgli does not seem to remember why it's important, it means enough to him to chase them to an ancient city. King Louie, of course, is the ruler, and gets his kicks by luring greedy humans into his treasure pit. Instead of a cobra guarding the loot, like in the book, we get Kaa. He attacks any intruders, while the monkeys watch from a safe distance. Since none of the animals talk, it's never made clear if the monkeys are sacrificing humans to Kaa to keep the snake from feeding on them, or if it's all done for their entertainment. It's probably a little of both. Most of the movie's focus, though, is on Mowgli's interactions with the world of man. Louie and Kaa are small potatoes compared to the human villains Mowgli faces. The British army is stationed nearby. As it turns out, Mowgli knew Kitty, the daughter of the colonel, when they were children, and a romance soon blossoms. This is much to the displeasure of Captain William Boone, played by Cary Elwes. Boone is Kitty's love interest now, or at least he was until this good-looking young man wandered out of the jungle. It's understandable why he hates Mowgli from the beginning. In order to make him a bit less sympathetic, a lot of his behavior shows he sees Kitty more as a prize or trophy than a person. Mowgli, unaware of the rigid social norms of the time, just loves Kitty for who she is. Things get worse when Boone sees a dagger Mowgli took from the treasure chamber after beating Kaa in a fight. Now possessed by greed, Boone teams up with two other army members, the bootlicking Wilkins, played by Jason Fleming, and the brutish Harley, played by Ron Danchi. They also team up with a pair of rogues, Buldeo, played by Stefan Khalifa, and Tabaki, played by Anirudh Agarwal. Buldeo and Tabaki, you'll recall, are named after characters from the original stories, although they don't resemble their namesakes much. For one thing, Tabaki isn't a jackal. This was just a nice tribute to Kipling's story. The final act has the jungle itself working as a force of justice to the soldiers and hunters. Each of the human villains, one by one, meets a gruesome fate. The only villain I haven't mentioned yet is Shere Khan. That's because in this movie, Khan isn't a villain at all. He's fearsome, but he acts as something of a demigod, protecting the jungle from evil men. Mowgli, in helping protect the jungle, actually earns the tiger's favor. I wanted to make a joke about how this predicted the less villainous versions of Cruella and Maleficent, but it doesn't really bother me much in this version. The animals in general are not the focus in the first place. Apparently, the reason for Shere Khan's heroic rewrite is because writer-director Stephen Sommers found the tiger too majestic an animal to kill in his story. And that's fine by me. The human villain deaths are plenty entertaining in their own right. Then there's the live-action version that no one really talks about. This one is a bit more obscure. It was most likely inspired by the 1994 remake, but it's not a sequel nor a prequel. It exists in another separate continuity, and follows a younger Mowgli and his animal friends and foes, all played by real jungle creatures. Once again, Shere Khan has his sights set on Mowgli, this time voiced by Sherman Howard. Tabaki actually gets to make a proper appearance, voiced by Stephen Tobolowsky. The only difference is he's not a jackal, but instead a hyena. I don't know if there's a reason for this. Maybe jackals are just harder to train. Khan also allies himself with the Bandar-Log, boasting a pretty decent voice cast among them. The chimps are voiced by Wallace Shawn, Richard Kind, Catherine Lloyd Burns, and Nancy Cartwright. The baboons and mandrills are voiced by Quinton Flynn, Frank Welker, and D. Bradley Baker. There's really not much to say about this. It's a direct-to-video movie aimed solely at kids with a lot of eye-rollingly bad jokes. I'm mentioning it mostly for completion's sake, and because Tabaki showing up is at least worth making a note. Also, Eartha Kitt voices Bagheera, which I'll admit is fun casting. And then there's Jungle Cubs. Because kids, apparently, wouldn't want to watch a cartoon about the mostly adult characters, this 90s cartoon is about the Jungle Book animals as children. Despite them butting heads in the movie, they were all good friends in their youth. Shere Khan, voiced by Jason Marsden, while still a standoffish bully, also has a timid, friendly side. Presumably, as he got older, he learned to repress anything that might make him vulnerable. He tends to take things seriously, readying himself to be the most feared predator in the jungle. His friends use this as an excuse to pick on him, not realizing that it will someday come back to bite them. Louie is voiced by Jason Marsden in the first season, and Cree Summer in the second. The second season also saw a change in his character design, making him a bit taller and trimming his hair. Louie appears to be the only character who visibly ages in the show, hinting that he's the oldest of the group. Either that, or someone just didn't like his first design. Oldest or not, Louie is usually the least mature. Just like later on, he never takes anything seriously. In one episode, though, he actually does try to prep for being the king, wanting to do what's best for all his subjects, monkeys or not. He even saves everyone from a roaring fire at the end. Either Louie forgot everything he learned from the experience as an adult, or the writers just didn't care. Ka, voiced again by Jim Cummings, is also interested in perfecting his predatory skills. His hypnotic abilities have not yet been developed, and usually backfire. Unlike Shere Khan, who does his best to keep everyone at a distance, Ka is incredibly friendly here. In fact, he's downright adorable most of the time. All of this makes the series unintentionally kind of depressing. I know this comes off as an adult overthinking a children's cartoon. Hi, welcome to my channel. But I'm actually speaking from experience here. I remember watching this show when it originally aired and being a little sad. All these characters, even Shere Khan, are friends. By the time they're adults, they've grown distant at best and are outright enemies at worst. It's not quite as melancholy as The Fox and the Hound, but it gives the whole show a rather downbeat vibe. This was compounded by a few video releases of the show. These included new wraparound animation of the adult animals reminiscing about their childhood. When Shere Khan corners them, Baloo tries to remind him that they were all friends once. The tiger no longer cares.
Oh, Baloo, the past is the past.
Someone should ask Shere Khan, Bagheera, and Hathi what happened to their American accents. What, did they just decide one day as they got older, hey, I'm gonna be British now? Meanwhile, Hathi's wife, Winifred, has an American accent as an adult and a British accent as a child. I know, at this point, I'm just splitting hairs over a Forgotten Kids show. Moving on. Since the main characters were all friends, the show needed some actual villains for them to fight. The most recurring ones are a pair of dim-witted vultures. Arthur and Cecil, voiced by David L. Lander and Michael McKean, are always hovering nearby, hungrily waiting for an accident to befall the cubs. If this was all they ever did, they wouldn't truly be villains, just an opportunistic pair following their instincts. What puts them in the villain category is their impatience. At several points, they try to speed things up and kill the cubs to ensure a meal. The most threatening recurring villains were a family of hillbilly baboons. Yes, you heard that right. Lurking in the dreaded wastelands, the baboons occasionally cause trouble for the cubs. Mara, voiced by Tress MacNeille, is the awful matriarch. Her sons, Ned, voiced by Charlie Adler, Jed and Fred, both voiced by Jim Cummings, act as her muscle. What they all lack in intellect, they make up for in strength and aggression. Not exactly main villain material, but they did appear the most next to the vultures. Most of the other antagonists were one-shot characters, and due to the length of this video, won't be fully explored. I do want to make a quick mention of a couple, both based on chapters from Kipling's original. The Doles appear in one episode, which directly adapts the Red Dog chapter, albeit with a less violent ending. The dogs are merely swept away by a river in this one, rather than getting slaughtered. Another episode adapts the chapter with a hidden treasure. The Cobra, giant in this version, once again appears as a guard. It's interesting how much Disney seemed to like this idea, which we'll see again in our next section all about the comics. Segue? Don't mind if I do. The characters lent themselves nicely to comics, but unfortunately, as is often the case, many were not printed in English. There are at least a few good ones printed in America that I can get some material out of. Shere Khan shows up fairly often, as you'd expect. At the same time, the comics never seem to overuse him. I imagine that could be easy to do. He's the most intimidating of the villains, which makes for good stories. However, if you let him be defeated too many times in silly ways, he stops being an incredible threat. Granted, he's still a tiger, but there's only so many times he can fail at catching Mowgli. Ka fares a bit better, since he was always rather silly. But he's still dangerous in his own right. It's not uncommon for him to put the squeeze on Mowgli, only to fail by sheer luck. Mowgli's luck, of course, not his. King Louie was probably the most interesting in the comics. A few stories made him into a harsher, more aggressive character. For the most part, though, it seemed like the comics generally got Louie's personality perfectly. He's a villain without realizing it most of the time. One particular story, A Clown is Crowned, did it best in my opinion. Louie is frustrated that no one calls him King Louie. Flunky, who actually gets addressed by name, suggests he needs a crown. Louie finds a hidden treasure chamber in his temple, complete with a crown. Unfortunately, Ka has also found the treasure and stands guard. Again, Disney loved this chapter. Louie and his monkeys prove to be no match for the snake. When Mowgli and Baloo refuse to help him, Louie kidnaps Shanti to force Mowgli's help. The whole time, Louie remains cheerful and friendly. It doesn't matter that he's traumatizing and endangering the lives of children. He wants what he wants. Never once does Louie consider the feelings of anyone else, even as he repeatedly conks Baloo on the head. And never once does he stop being entertaining. A couple comics also show what would happen if Louie did get access to fire. Predictably, it's nothing good. In one story, he immediately loses control of the flame and panics. Another time, he uses it to throw his weight around. Both times result in potential danger that the elephants have to put out, and both times Louie does not appear to learn much. There was a fourth recurring villain in the comics, one not seen in any other Disney media. Old Mugger, a crocodile, also repeatedly tried to make a meal of Mowgli. His personality was never quite as developed as the other characters. He was a snide, crafty predator, but there wasn't much to set him apart from Shere Khan or Kaa. He did team up with him a few times to eat Mowgli once and for all. You can probably guess how that turned out for them. As a note, a Mugger crocodile did appear in one of the Kipling Jungle Book stories, although it was a standalone chapter that wasn't related to Mowgli or his adventures. This character was just as devious and loved the taste of humans. I wouldn't be surprised if Disney's Old Mugger was loosely inspired by him. That brings us to the Jungle Book video games. Given its cast of memorable characters and its exotic locale, it makes sense that there would be quite a few games based on the franchise. A platform game based on the movie was released in 1994 for several consoles, both from Nintendo and Sega. Despite their differences, they're generally similar. Kaa, Louie, and Shere Khan all act as bosses in that order. Kaa, seemingly longer than ever, menaces you in the treetops, firing hypnotic beams at you. Defeating him will send him crashing to the ground like in the movie. King Louie's battle is clever. Always wanting to be more like a man than a monkey, Louie actually apes your own attacks. He uses your weapons, bananas and coconuts, against you. Nice touch. Shere Khan, of course, is the final boss. Some versions have you attack him normally, while others make it so that a special fire attack will defeat the tiger. The monkeys are a natural pick for enemies fought in various levels. In a few, though not all versions of the game, they also make a boss fight. Appearing between Kaa and Louie's battles, 3 monkeys hide behind an enormous mask and use it as a shield. One of these stranger games is Jungle Book Rhythm and Groove for the PlayStation. It's essentially a CGI retelling of the first movie as a Dance Dance Revolution game. It follows the plot closely, but as almost every character, good or bad, challenge Mowgli to a dance-off. Only the bare necessities and I Wanna Be Like You are carried over from the movie, giving everyone else an original song. Of the relevant new songs, the monkeys have Go Bananas in the Coconut Tree, Shere Khan has Run, and Kaa has A Mood for Food. If you're wondering, Kaa's new song definitely has some similarities in tone to Trust in Me, to the point where I wonder why they didn't just use that song in the first place. Although the Sega game QuackShot was not based on the Jungle Book, Shere Khan and Kaa still appear. Or at least characters that strongly resemble them do. Donald Duck is on a race to find a treasure before Pete. Along the way, he fights a tiger boss with a face that looks very much like Shere Khan. The difference is their body type. This is a plump tiger who can also breathe fire. So most likely it's not Khan himself, but there's no mistaking that face. Kaa is not a boss, but still appears as the basis for an enemy. Several snake charmers encountered apparently double as duck charmers. They'll try to hypnotize Donald with their music. When the duck is put into a trance, they will sick their snakes on him, all of them looking identical to Kaa. The villains have, of course, appeared a few times at the Disney parks. Shere Khan and Kaa, to my knowledge, have never been walk-around characters. I don't think either of them would really translate into this well, and it's most likely they'll never appear in this manner. But stranger things have happened. King Louie, as it so often happens, does not seem to be regarded as a villain, so is not regulated to Halloween appearances. He can often be met as a normal character, and on a personal note, when I was a character attendant, he was one of the first guys I ever worked with. I'll be skimming over most of Louie's solo appearances because of this. In the eyes of the theme park, he's not a villain, and most of his appearances in live shows have had a friendly Louie who definitely doesn't want to burn down the entire jungle. Although Kaa is generally considered more of a villain than Louie, he has also made a surprising amount of friendly appearances. He and Louie are both part of the orchestra in the Mickey Mouse Revue, with an animatronic Kaa somehow playing his own tail like a flute. In the Disneyland version of Fantasmic, a larger-than-life Kaa slithers around in the jungle section. Unlike most of the villains, he doesn't try to menace Mickey in any way, and just seems to be hanging out. Louie and his monkeys also appear, happy to just join the party. Over in Shanghai Disneyland, Kaa has a place in the Garden of the 12 Friends. This pleasant outdoor area has mosaics based on the Chinese zodiac, with Kaa representing the snake. The most major attraction for the characters was a live show that opened with the Animal Kingdom. Journey into Jungle Book only ran for about a year and was a staged version of the movie. All the characters were either live actors or large puppets. Louie and his monkeys, of course, did a spirited rendition of their song in the Jungle Temple. Shere Khan was a puppet performed to pre-recorded audio by Tony J. One major character missing was Kaa. I found some professionally recorded audio of the show's soundtrack, which featured Jim Cummings as Kaa singing Trust in Me. I've also found at least 2 promotional materials referencing either Ka or the song. However, none of the footage recorded by guests that has made its way onto YouTube feature the snake. If I had to make an educated guess, I'd say that Ka was cut before the attraction actually opened. If anyone does recall seeing Ka, or has any pictures or video, please let me know in the comments. In addition to the Animal Kingdom show, The Jungle Book actually received its own professionally staged musical. In 2013, the show had tryouts in Chicago and Boston. Nothing seems to have happened since then, but based on a video of one of the performances, it looked like a fun take on the material. Parts followed the movie closely, while others added elements from the book and a distinctly Indian flair in the music and costuming. Ka and King Louie are very much their old selves here. Their cartoon counterparts are plenty theatrical as it is. Ka has some added puppetry effects, of course, but the bulk of the performance comes from the visible actors, much like The Lion King or Avenue Q. King Louie and his monkeys are wild as ever and get an additional song. The road song of the Bandar-Log, which they sing after I Want to Be Like You, is a jazzy number directly based on one of Kipling's poems. Shere Khan is done a bit differently. For one thing, he is said to be lame, making this the only time Disney has included that detail. He is still fearsome and cruel as ever, even getting to kill a deer at one point. It's very stylized, but it's still more than the animated one ever did on screen. Khan also gets a song, something he did not have in the movie. Your Unexpected Friend is about how death is inevitable, but often comes as a surprise. Speaking of death, along with the 2016 remake, this is the only Disney version of the story to actually kill Shere Khan. Instead of scaring him away with the flaming branch, Mowgli actually sets him on fire and mortally wounds him near the end. Khan's death is surprisingly touching. In his dying moments, the tiger admits he led a sad, lonely existence and hopes that his next life will be a friendlier one. On that somber, reflective note, we'll move to a much more lighthearted topic. TaleSpin is an odd concept for a show, but a very well executed one. What if Baloo was a delivery pilot in the 1930s? What if Louie ran a nightclub and Shere Khan was a ruthless corporate executive? Random? Very. But it resulted in one of the most entertaining Disney shows from that era. Not every idea will make a good show, but TaleSpin is proof that any idea has potential. Given how out of left field this show is compared with the rest of the franchise, I decided to put it last, in its own little section. If it wasn't for the presence of Shere Khan as one of the main antagonists, it might have been put in an entirely different video entry. We won't dwell on Louie too much for this section. He is firmly on the good guy's side, running his own club with the monkeys as his workers. Louie has gone from the sketchy weirdo who throws good parties, to the kind, beloved uncle who throws good parties. Shere Khan, meanwhile, is just as fearsome, if not worse. Being the apex predator in the jungle is one thing, but in the civilized world, you need to be a different kind of cutthroat. Khan is now the leader of Khan Industries, the biggest, most powerful corporation in Cape Suzette. He takes his position deathly seriously, and has no time for nonsense. In a lot of ways, he's like Scrooge McDuck, without any sense of whimsy. He could probably swim in a money tank himself, but he wouldn't see the point. What makes Khan interesting is that he isn't always a villain, although he's certainly ruthless enough to qualify as one. He has a sense of honor, and comes across as much more nuanced than in the Jungle Book. He cares about money first and foremost, but if someone does help him, he always repays them. He seems to have some degree of respect for Baloo, for example. Despite Baloo being a ditz and a lazy bungler, he's a brilliant pilot. Shere Khan knows this, and has rewarded him several times. At the same time, Khan knows Baloo's ego can override his common sense, and has also used him as a patsy in some dangerous jobs. The most underhanded thing Khan ever did in TaleSpin was directly working with Cape Suzette's biggest criminal, Don Carnage. Shere Khan once hired Carnage to steal oil, manufacturing a gas crisis in order to drive up the prices. Their team-up didn't last long, and there have been other times, before and after that, where Carnage has tried to steal from Khan. The two are in no way friends, and rarely allies, but the fact that Khan was willing to work with pirates once means he'd probably be willing to do so again. Even with his moments of kindness, or at least gratitude toward Baloo, he is more easily classified as an antagonist. That brings us to Don Carnage himself. Carnage is the show's main villain, a dashing wolf air pirate. Jim Cummings provides the voice in one of his finest performances, giving him a bizarre amalgamation of romantic language accents. Carnage thinks highly of himself, which is not totally unwarranted. Although he always fails at his missions, this being a Disney cartoon in the 90s, he still has a certain flair to whatever he does. He has a deadly reputation, and it's implied that he's a lot more successful off-screen. Pilots are never happy to see Carnage and his men, and it feels like Baloo might be the only one to consistently triumph over him. Carnage fully embraces his pirate identity, wanting only to pillage and plunder. His biggest goal is Cape Suzette itself, although he rarely gets by the guard posts. Even without the town, he's always ready to target any cargo plane he sees passing by in his own airship, the Iron Vulture. Like Shere Khan, Carnage has a sense of honor in spite of everything. He just uses it a lot less. But at least twice, he's been forced to team up with Baloo due to circumstances outside their control. Overall, Carnage is a lot of fun, and probably one of the best villains in a Disney afternoon show. He's so incredibly flamboyant, but he never loses that air of menace. This is a real pirate who has killed people, even if we never see it. He is accompanied by his motley crew of air pirates. There's certainly power in numbers, but his henchmen are so generally incompetent, you wonder why Carnage doesn't just do it on his own. There are many pirates of varying shapes and sizes, but we'll focus on the main three. The first mate, Mad Dog, voiced by Charlie Adler, is possibly one of the worst second-in-commands you could ever ask for. He's cowardly, lazy, and double-crossed Carnage at least once. If it wasn't for his incessant bootlicking and groveling, when he's not complaining, I bet Carnage would have killed him years ago. Dump Truck, voiced by Chuck McCann, is much more willing to charge into battle, and has the brute strength to back him up. Unfortunately, he's about as smart as his name implies. He's a bit more positive-minded compared to Mad Dog, but don't let that fool you. He's not a sweet guy who doesn't know any better. He's perfectly willing, and happy, to get violent. Gibber, also voiced by McCann, acts as something of an advisor to Carnage, with almost all his dialogue consisting of whispers in his boss's ear. He's not all that helpful, but he still comes across a little more put together than his associates. Carnage got to appear outside the series at a few points. First, he hosted an episode of the short-lived anthology Raw Tunage. In Carnage's segments, he demonstrated treasure hunting, only for Captain Hook to beat him to the punch. Carnage, a skilled swordsman, actually lost to Hook in a battle. As I said in my Hook video, this really says a lot about Captain Hook. When he's not fighting Peter Pan, he's a credible threat. Carnage became a walk-around character at Disneyland for a short time. In the early 90s, the area by It's a Small World became Disney Afternoon Avenue. Carnage could meet guests, and also starred as one of the villains in the Plain Crazy stage show. He teamed up with Chippendale's nemesis, Fat Cat, to steal a government spy plane. Although the egotistical baddies butt heads a few times, they get along surprisingly well. But this is Disneyland, so good will always triumph over evil. Baloo, Chip, Dale, and Launchpad ultimately foil their plans. Carnage went on to appear in the DuckTales reboot, voiced by Jamie Camille. Well, technically, according to the creators, this is another person who's taken up the Carnage mantle. Whoever he is, he does a good job emulating the dashing, over-the-top theatrics that made us love Carnage in the first place. This Carnage found a worthy foe in Dewey Duck. It makes perfect sense. After Dewey inadvertently inspired a mutiny and wound up becoming the new captain, of course Carnage would hold a grudge. But it wasn't just that. Dewey did the most heinous thing anyone could do to Carnage. He stole the spotlight. Even after regaining his crew, Carnage spends the rest of the series swearing vengeance on the only person to ever upstage him, and live. Speaking of his crew, Carnage has a bunch of pirates assisting him. Given that they only appear in a few episodes, none of them get much development. His first mate, Pegleg Meg, voiced by Kimberly Brooks, probably gets the most screen time, but that's not saying too much. Here's hoping we get a follow-up TaleSpin series to see more of these guys. Another villain that Baloo had to regularly contend with was Colonel Ivanhoe Spigot. Perhaps you've heard of him. Spigot, voiced by Michael Goff, is from the far-off chilly land of Thembria. Thembria is a very, very, very thinly veiled parody of Soviet Russia. Generally, Thembrians value only a few things: bureaucracies, elaborate executions, and themselves. Spigot does almost everything he can for the glory of his country and to please his High Marshal, voiced by Jack Angel. Unfortunately for Spigot, he seems to be permanently on the Marshal's bad side, one slip-up away from being killed. Even if he wasn't serving his country out of a mix of pride and fear, Spigot probably wouldn't be the best guy. He has a major Napoleon complex due to his short height, and takes every chance he has to lash out and bully those around him. Even in the episodes where he's more of an ally to Baloo, there's always a sense of animosity on his side. Meanwhile, Spigot's second-in-command, Sergeant Dunder, is one of the only nice Thembrians we ever meet. Voiced by Lorenzo Music, Dunder is the opposite of Spigot. Tall, friendly, and patient. Despite all of Spigot's insults and mistreatment, Dunder remains loyal to his colonel. While Spigot fears getting shot by the High Marshal, Dunder sees it as an honor. After all, he is still a Thembrian. Finally, there's Trader Mo. A diminutive alligator voiced by Jim Cummings, Mo alternates between being a shrewd businessman and an all-out criminal. He's not called Trader Mo for nothing. He's very skilled in knowing exactly what certain high-paying clients want. Other times, he's just about stealing valuable items. Baloo and Kit have run afoul of him at several points, and would have gotten themselves killed if not for two things: Moe's hulking henchmen. Moe's goons, a gorilla voiced by Jim Cummings and a rhino voiced by Chuck McCann, are quite possibly the dumbest characters in the show. And if you know Carnage's own henchmen, that's really saying something. Moe was clearly focusing on their size rather than their wit when hiring these guys. If you literally told them up was down, they'd probably believe you. TaleSpin also had a number of interesting one-shot villains. For everyone's patience, along with my own, I'm not going to get into them, but I will make a quick mention of one character for the Jungle Book connection. Thaddeus E. Clang, voiced by Tim Curry, is a snake that has somehow equipped himself with robot prosthetics, giving him limbs. When he's defeated, his robot parts break off. As he slinks away in shame, we can see he has a knot in his tail. I'm guessing that's a nod to Ka, who never actually appeared in the show himself. TaleSpin received several video games, each of them featuring Carnage and Shere Khan. The Capcom game for the NES had the pirates constantly getting in the way of Baloo's deliveries. Carnage is battled near the end, followed by an attack on the Iron Vulture. Shere Khan is revealed to be the one ordering the attacks, in an attempt to seize Hire for Hire, the company Baloo works for. The Sega Mega Drive game once again features Khan as the main villain. Hire for Hire is competing with Khan Industries in a contest to earn a lifetime work contract from the city. Khan himself is never fought, but Jibber, Mad Dog, Dump Truck, and of course Don Carnage are. The PC game, meanwhile, has Baloo and Kit trying to piece together a relic that will lead them to a treasure. Several villains are holding a piece and need to be battled, including Carnage, Colonel Spigot, and Shere Khan. This is notably the only game where Khan is directly fought. And that concludes this entry in the retrospective. The next feature to hit theaters was The Aristocats in 1970, but we're not getting to that one just yet. I apologize to Edgar the Butler's fans, all 5 of them. In 1968, the second Pooh short, Winnie the Pooh and the Blustery Day, premiered, and with that came a literally nightmarish group of honey-stealing heffalumps and woozles. In our next entry, we'll be looking at the relatively dark side of the 100-Acre Wood. I want to end this video by giving a quick shout-out to Melody Palat for providing some of the pictures seen in this video. Thanks very much, and I'll see you all next time.
Oh, I hate that Chip and Dale.
Which is Chip, which is Dale? Well, never mind, I want them dead!
That sea duck will be a sitting duck.